The terminal buzzed with the sounds of rolling luggage, distant chatter, and the faint hum of flight announcements. Overhead, Denver International Airport was alive with the controlled chaos of travelers racing against time, clutching boarding passes and overpriced coffees. Officer Sarah Collins adjusted her K9 partner Max's harness as they moved through Gate 23. Max, a lean and alert Belgian Malinois, walked in perfect rhythm. Beside her ears, perked amber eyes sharp. "All right, Max," Sarah murmured under her breath, her fingers grazing the silver badge on her chest. "Routine patrol. No surprises today." "Okay," but surprises rarely asked permission. As they passed a row of vending machines tucked against a steel grey wall, Max stopped abruptly. His muscular body went rigid, nose twitching, as if an invisible thread had snapped tight around him. Then, without warning, he let out a sharp bark, one that cut through the background noise like glass shattering on marble. "Max heels," Sarah commanded, but Max was locked in place. His eyes fixed on the vending machine in front of him. He barked again, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the terminal. Passengers turned brows, furrowed in curiosity and irritation. A mother pulled her child closer. A TSA agent nearby shifted nervously. Sarah crouched beside Max, her hand firmly on his harness. "What is it, buddy? What do you smell?" Max growled low, his nose pressed against the thin seam. Along the side of the vending machine he pawed at the base, his claws scraping against the metal panel. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Mom, is everything okay?" A uniformed airport security guard approached his voice. No," Sarah said, standing. "Tool, something's wrong here. Get maintenance down here." Now the guard hesitated, glancing at the vending machine, then back at Sarah. "It's just a snack machine, officer." Max barked again, almost as if he could sense the dismissal in the guard's tone. His tail was stiff, hackles raised along his spine. "It's not just a snack machine," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the man's hesitation. "Call maintenance now." 15 minutes later, a tired-looking maintenance worker in a neon vest arrived, toolbox in hand. His reluctance was obvious as he began unscrewing the vending machine's side panel. The tension in the air felt like a towel wire about to snap. Sarah kept a hand on Max's harness, her other resting lightly on the sidearm, holstered at her hip. Okay. The worker muttered the final screw, clattered to the floor, and he pried the panel loose. The smell hit them. First, stale air, sweat, something sickly. Sweet Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the hidden compartment inside the vending machine was revealed. Curled in the small, dark space was a child, a little girl, no older than 4. Her face was streaked with tears, her cheeks sunken from dehydration. Big brown eyes blinked slowly at the sudden light, as if she wasn't sure if this was reality or another nightmare. "Oh my God," the guard whispered behind Sarah. The girl whimpered softly, flinching as the maintenance worker stepped back. His face pale, Sarah dropped to her knees, her voice soft, gentle. "Hey there, sweetheart, you're safe now, we've got you." Max lowered himself to the ground, his ears flat, his tail sweeping gently across the tile floor. Slowly the girl reached out a trembling hand, her tiny fingers brushing Max's fur. "She's alive," Sarah said, barely above a whisper, before turning back to the guard. "Get EMS here now and lock down this gate. No one leaves until we figure out how this happened." The terminal was no longer a place of idle chatter and travel plans. It was silent, save for the occasional distant beep of airport equipment and the soft murmurs of passengers being redirected away from Gate 23. The vending machine, now surrounded by police tape, stood like a grotesque monument to something far darker than anyone wanted to admit. Sarah stood with Max a few feet away, watching as paramedics carefully carried the child out on a stretcher. Her small hand clutched a stuffed bear someone had given her, her eyes never leaving Max. "She wouldn't have been found if it weren't for you," Sarah said softly, crouching to meet Max's steady gaze. She rubbed behind his ears, her throat tight. "Good boy. You're a damn good boy." Max's tail gave a faint wag, but his eyes remained fixed on the vending machine. He let out a low whine, almost as if he was trying to tell Sarah something. His nose twitched, and then he turned his head slightly toward another vending machine across the gate. Sarah's heart stopped for just a moment, Max. She began her voice, almost a plea, but Max was already on his feet, body tense, nose pointed toward the second machine. The realization hit Sarah like a freight train. If there was one child, could there be more? Get maintenance back.
"Here!" Sarah shouted already, pulling Max with her toward the second machine behind her. The airport staff scrambled into action, the maintenance worker fumbling with his radio, passengers whispering in growing panic. Max was already barking again, sharp, urgent, undeniable. Sarah's hand hovered over her holstered weapon as she stared at the second vending machine. The world seemed to narrow to just that rectangle of glass and steel, and the faint possibility of another life hidden just out of sight. The fluorescent lights of the terminal cast a sterile glow on Sarah's face as she stood rigid in front of the second vending machine. Max's muscles, tow beneath his coat, growled low and steady, his nose pressed firmly against the glass around them. Airport security, scrambled maintenance workers, fumbled with their tools, and passengers clutched their bags tighter, their faces etched with fear and confusion. "Open it now," Sarah said, her voice sharp and leaving no room for argument. The same maintenance worker from earlier fumbled with his screwdriver, his hands trembling. I'm going as fast as I can." Max barked a sharp, commanding sound that seemed to shake the air. Sarah reached down her hand, brushing the fur on his back, her touch grounding them both. She could feel his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her palm. The P finally gave way with a screech of metal against metal. Sarah leaned forward, her stomach churning with anticipation, but this time the compartment was empty. Nothing. Just dark space, crumpled wrappers, and an overwhelming scent of something stale and chemical. Max didn't move, though his nose twitched, and his body remained locked in that same stiff posture. Sarah felt it too. Something was off. There was no way he would have reacted so intensely without reason. "Officer Collins," a voice called behind her, and she turned to see Agent Kyle Harris from the FBI approaching mid-30s, sharp suit and sharper eyes. He flashed his badge as he approached, glancing briefly at Max before meeting Sarah's gaze. "We've secured the first child check on her way to the hospital," Harris said, "but I need you to step back. This is a federal investigation." "Now, with all due respect, Agent Harris, my K9 isn't wrong," Sarah said. Standing her ground, he reacted to this machine for a reason. Harris hesitated, glancing between the empty compartment and the dog, still growling softly. "All right," he said finally, "but let's be smart about this. Get a forensic team in here. We're not letting this terminal turn into a circus." Hours later, the terminal was sectioned off with barriers and police tape. Sarah sat on the floor beside Max, her back against the cold metal wall. The vending machines were surrounded by technicians in blue gloves, their tools clinking and murmur, rising softly into the still air. Max had finally settled, though his head rested on his paw, eyes still fixed on the second machine officer. Collins' Agent Harris approached, crouching down to meet her. "At eye level, we found something." Sarah's breath caught. "What is it?" Harris glanced at Max. "Your partner was right. There's a faint scent. Trail chemicals, human sweat traces of something wrong. Whoever's been using these machines to smuggle children, they've been careful, but not careful enough." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "So there were more, we think. So we've flagged vending machines in 3 other airports with similar signs, but it's bigger than that." Harris handed her a tablet, showing a digital map dotted with red marks across the country. "These machines are part of a tring route. Denver was just a node in the chain.
The air felt heavy around Sarah, pressing against her chest. Max shifted beside her, his tail giving one slow wag before resting still again. "What's our next move?" she asked. The command center had been hastily set up in a nearby conference room. Monitors glowed with live feeds from security cameras, maps filled with red pins and flight logs scrolling in real time. Sarah stood at the edge of the room watching agents move with frantic precision. "This isn't a local operation," Harris said, pacing in front of the map. "It's coordinated. Someone on the inside is feeding them information baggage schedules, maintenance access, security, blind spots, and they're doing it right under our noses." Sarah's jaw clenched. "How do we stop it?" Before Harris could answer, a voice crackled over the radio agent. "Harris, we've got a report from an airport in Dallas. Another vending machine anomaly?" And static interrupted the rest of the transmission, but Sarah caught one word. "Child, we can't wait," Sarah said. Stepping forward, "Every second counts. We have to assume there are more children out there right now, scared alone and running out of time." Harris hesitated. "You're right, but we can't go charging in blindly. Sarah, we need to—" Max barked once, twice, a sharp, urgent sound that silenced the room. Everyone turned to look at the dog. His head was raised, ears pointed forward, nose twitching. Again, Sarah's chest tightened. Max smelled something. The command center went still. Sarah followed Max's lead as he moved toward a maintenance access door at the far end of the conference room. He sniffed the crack along the floor and let out a deep growl. "Open it." Sarah said. "An agent hesitated. That leads to the underground service tunnels." "Then that's where we're going." The tunnel was dark, damp, and filled with the faint hum of machinery. Overhead, the air smelled of mildew, metal, and something sharper, something human. Max LED, the way his paws clicking softly against the concrete floor. Sarah walked close behind him, her flashlight cutting a narrow beam of light through the darkness behind her. Agent Harris followed his firearm. "Drawn, do you smell that?" Sarah whispered. Harris nodded, ammonia sweat. They turned a corner, and Max froze. His tail was stiff, his ears locked forward ahead of them. Faint light spilled from an open doorway. The sound of soft crying echoed through the corridor. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. She crouched beside Max, her hand on his back. "Easy, buddy, we've got this." They moved forward slowly, silently. Sarah's heart ached with every muffled SOB she heard. Inside the room, she could make out the shapes of two vending machines, their panels removed, and small figures, children huddled in fear. A shadow shifted in the corner, and Sarah caught the glint of a gun barrel. "Drop it," she shouted. The man spun, his weapon raising, but Max lunged before he could fire. The dog's growl was thunderous as he collided with the man, teeth sinking into his arm. The gun clattered to the floor. Sarah rushed forward, securing the weapon and restraining the man while Harris moved to comfort the children. "It's okay," Sarah said, softly, as she approached the trembling kids. "You're safe now." Max released the man, stepping back to Sarah's side, his chest heaving, but his eyes locked on the children. In that moment, Sarah realized the weight of what Max had uncovered, the dark network they'd stumbled upon, the lives saved because one dog refused to walk away from a vending machine. But deep down, she also knew this wasn't over. The fluorescent lights of the underground service tunnel flickered as Sarah leaned against the cold concrete wall. Her breath uneven. Max sat at her feet, his amber eyes locked on her face. Ears perked, but his body visibly tired behind them. Agent Harris was coordinating with teams upstairs, arranging for the children they'd found to be taken to safety. The air was thick with a cocktail of sweat mildew and something else, something darker, that clung to Sarah's clothes and skin. But the faint sound of children's voices murmuring reassurances to one another in the background reminded her why they were there. "Good boy, Max," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached down to scratch behind his ears. Max leaned into her touch, his tail giving a faint wag. Despite the exhaustion in his posture, Agent Harris approached his expression. "Grave, the kids are being transported to the hospital. They're shaken up, malnourished, but they'll recover, physically, psychologically." He let the words hang in the air. Sarah exhaled through her nose, her eyes focused on a crack in the concrete floor. And the suspect Harris crossed his arms, his jaw tight. He's not talking, but the documents we found in his bag, along with encrypted messages on his phone, confirm it. This is a trafficking network, and it's bigger than we thought the vending machines are, just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah pushed away from the wall, her spine straightening, as if her body remembered the weight of duty. "So what now?" Harris hesitated for, "Now you and Max need rest. You've done more than enough." "But," Sarah shook her head, her voice firm, "no, we're not done. There are more kids out there. Harris, every minute we waste is another minute they're trapped in some dark hole, waiting for someone to find them." Harris sighed. "I knew you'd say that. But before we move forward, there's something you need to deal with first. The police K-9 unit training facility was a 2-hour drive outside Denver, tucked away in a quiet forested corner of Colorado. Sarah stood by the chain-link fence watching as Max bounded across the training yard, his energy seemingly renewed after hours of sleep in the back of her SUV. His black and tan coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, and his sharp eyes scanned every corner of the yard. Officer Dave Miller, an older handler with salt and pepper hair, and a steady gaze leaned against the fence beside her. "You know, Sarah, not every handler can keep up with a dog like Max." Sarah smirked faintly, and not every handler gets a partner like him. They watched in silence as Max caught a training dummy mid-air with pinpoint accuracy, his jaw locking around it before trotting proudly back to his handler. Dave's voice softened. "You've got that look again, the one you had after the Henderson case?" Sarah flinched slightly at the name. The Henderson case, a failed hostage rescue 2 years ago. She'd been part of the SWAT team. Max had been there too, but they hadn't been able to save the child that day. It was the first and only time Max had hesitated. "I keep thinking," Sarah began, but stopped herself. Her hand clenched around the cold metal fence. "What if we missed something? What if there's another vending machine somewhere with another kid waiting, scared, running out of time?" Dave nodded slowly. "Sarah, you and Max have already saved lives, but if you're going to keep going, you can't carry every ghost with you." She turned to face him, her eyes sharp and determined. "I'm not stopping, Dave. I'm not leaving those kids out there." Dave looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Then trust him, Sarah. Trust Max. He hasn't let you down yet." That evening, back in her small apartment overlooking the Denver skyline, Sarah sat on the floor with Max sprawled beside her. His head rested on her lap, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes still watching her. Every move the room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting golden light over framed photos of Sarah and Max at various milestones, his graduation from K-9 school, their first big case, their commendation ceremony after a successful rescue operation. "Do you remember?" Henderson buddy Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "You froze, and I didn't know if I'd ever get you back after that." Max's ears flicked slightly as if he recognized the name. Sarah rubbed the fur between his ears. Her touch gentle, "But you came back to me, Max. You always come back for a moment." It felt as if time froze. The bond between them was a lifeline, unspoken, unbreakable. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She grabbed it, her stomach tightening when she saw the caller. ID Agent Harris. Sarah Harris's voice was sharp. "Urgent. We've tracked another vending machine anomaly. This one's in a freight terminal outside Dallas. It's active." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Active, as in someone's there right now?" "Yes. And Sarah, this isn't just another node. We think this might be their main distribution Point. Sarah didn't hesitate. We'll be there. She hung up and looked down at Max. He was already sitting up, ears pricked forward, tail slightly wagging as if he knew. Looks like we're not done yet, partner, Sarah said softly. Max let out a quiet bark. His amber eyes locked onto hers with unshakable trust. The next morning, Sarah and Max boarded a small private plane chartered by the FBI. The engines roared as the aircraft climbed into the sky. The city of Denver shrinking below them. Sarah leaned back in her seat, one hand resting on Max's harness. Agent Harris sat across from her. Flipping through a stack of files. We'll land at a private airstrip just outside Dallas. Our teams are already in place. Sarah nodded her gaze. Steady, we'll finish this. Max's head rested against her knee, his eyes closing briefly, as the hum of the engines filled the cabin, but Sarah could feel it, the quiet readiness in his body, the anticipation that matched her own. They were heading straight into the heart of darkness, but this time Sarah wasn't afraid, because Max was by her side, and together they would find every last child hidden behind every last vending machine. The freight terminal outside Dallas was a sprawling labyrinth of warehouses, loading docks, and endless rows of stacked shipping containers. The night sky was a blanket of black, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. Floodlights painted harsh white patches across the concrete ground, throwing long, sharp shadows. The air buzzed with the distant hum of diesel engines and the metallic clang of cargo being moved. Sarah adjusted Max's harness, her gloved hand brushing against his fur. He was tense, his body coiled like a spring, every muscle primed for action. Agent Harris stood nearby, his earpiece crackling with updates from the tactical teams positioned around the perimeter. This is it, Harris said, his voice low but steady. Our informant confirmed it. This warehouse is a central hub. The traffickers use vending machines disguised as standard cargo shipments. They're here tonight, moving another batch. Sarah's stomach turned at the word batch, like the children were cargo, disposable, replaceable. Max knows what to do, she said firmly, looking down at her partner. His amber eyes glinted in the faint light, locked onto the warehouse ahead. We go in quiet. Max leads. Harris nodded his face. Grim lettern move inside. The warehouse was cavernous. Its high ceilings disappearing into shadow crates were stacked in chaotic rows, each one labeled with cryptic serial numbers. The air was thick with the smell of machine oil, damp cardboard, and something faintly metallic. The distant sound of muffled voices echoed through the darkness. Max's nose twitched, and he moved forward with purpose, his paws silent on the concrete floor. Sarah followed close behind, her sidearm drawn, her heart hammering in her chest. Harris shadowed them, his weapon, raised eyes darting between the aisles. Suddenly Max stopped dead in his tracks, his head snapped to the right, his body low, ling into a stalking stance. His growl, a low rumbling sound that vibrated through Sarah's boots, was barely audible but unmistakable. Sarah signaled Harris with a hand gesture, and they moved toward the source of Max's focus around the corner. They saw it, a row of vending machines still wrapped in industrial plastic, lined against a wall like silent sentinels. Their dull glass fronts reflected the harsh overhead lights, but it wasn't the machines themselves that made Sarah's breath hitch. It was the faint, rhythmic tapping coming from one of them like tiny knuckles against glass. "There's someone in there," Sarah whispered. Harris spoke softly into his radio. "We've located the machines moving in to secure." Sarah moved forward slowly, keeping her steps light. Max stayed at her side, his ears flat against his head as they approached the nearest machine. Sarah could see it, a pair of tiny eyes wide with fear, staring back at her through the narrow seam of the hidden compartment. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, kneeling down so she was eye level with the glass. "We're here to help the child inside." Couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Their face was pale, lips trembling. Max nudged Sarah's arm, his gaze flicking to the shadows above a noise, soft but deliberate, echoed from the upper walkway. Sarah's head snapped up just in time to see a figure dart between crates on the mezzanine level. "They know we're here," Harris hissed. Chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded from above, bullets ricocheting off metal crates. Sarah ducked behind the vending machines, her arm wrapping around Max to shield him as sparks flew overhead. "Cover fire," Harris shouted into his radio. "We've got hostiles." Max barked sharply, pulling against Sarah's hold, his instincts screaming to pursue. Sarah met his eyes and nodded. "Go." Max, find them. Max bolted across the warehouse floor, his lean body weaving between crates with unmatched precision. Sarah rose from her cover, firing 2 rounds toward the walkway above. A figure crumpled and fell from the railing with a sickening thud. Harris gestured to Sarah, "Secure the kids. I'll cover." Max, Sarah's hands, trembled slightly. As she pried open the compartment of the vending machine, the child inside flinched as the panel gave way, but Sarah spoke softly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "You're safe now, sweetheart. Come on, let's get you out of here." She reached in her fingers, brushing against small, trembling hands. The child was light as a feather as Sarah lifted them out, holding them close against her chest. "I've got you," behind her. More vending machines were being opened by tactical officers, each revealing more frightened children, some silent, others sobbing softly. The horrific efficiency of the operation made Sarah's stomach churn. Sarah Harris's voice cracked over the radio. "Max has found something you need to see." This Sarah handed the child to a waiting paramedic and followed Harris's signal through the maze of crates at the far end of the warehouse. Max was standing in front of a heavy steel door. His growls were deep, continuous, his entire body rigid with tension. His claws scraped at the floor as he shifted his teeth. "Bede! What is it, buddy?" Sarah whispered. Harris caught up, panting slightly. "We found blueprints in one of the crates. That door leads to an underground loading bay. It's their exit route. Is it locked?" Sarah asked. Harris nodded and reinforced Weck-need explosives to get through. Max barked, short, sharp, impatient. "Or," Sarah said softly, crouching next to her partner. "We TR him." She removed Max's leash, her hand stroking his back. "Go, Max, find them." Max lunged at the door with surprising force, his jaws snapping around the handle, his paws scrambling against the concrete floor. After a moment they heard a faint click as the latch gave way. The door creaked open into darkness. Harris flicked on his flashlight, revealing a dimly lit tunnel filled with the sound of running footsteps. Voices shouted in the distance. Panicked, desperate, they're running," Sarah said, her voice cold. Max bolted into the tunnel. Sarah and Harris close behind. The chase was frantic. Footsteps echoed off the tunnel walls as they closed in on the traffickers. Max surged ahead, his bark sharp and furious. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, catching glimpses of retreating figures. Finally, Max lunged, tackling a man to the ground. Sarah and Harris caught up, just as Max's teeth sank into the man's arm, preventing him from reaching for a concealed weapon. "It's over," Sarah shouted, her gun aimed at the remaining figures who froze in place. Hands raised. The sound of approaching sirens filled the tunnel, bouncing off the cold stone walls. Sarah holstered her weapon and knelt beside Max, her hand resting on his side. "Good boy, Max, you did it." The traffickers were cuffed. The remaining children were found in nearby crates, and the tunnels were sealed. As Sarah sat on the cold tunnel floor, Max curled beside her, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. But in his amber eyes there was something unshakable: trust, loyalty, and a quiet victory. The weight of their work still hung heavy, but for now they had saved lives, and sometimes, Sarah realized, that's enough. The faint orange glow of dawn crept over the Dallas freight terminal, casting long shadows over the aftermath of the operation. Tactical teams moved through the wreckage of crates and vending machines, marking evidence and cataloguing every horrific detail of the trafficking network they'd uncovered. The children, wrapped in emergency blankets, were being loaded carefully into ambulances by medics with hushed reassurances and gentle touches. Sarah sat on the steps of a cargo container. Max sprawled at her feet, his chest rose and fell in slow, heavy breaths, his body still trembling with exhaustion from the long pursuit through the tunnels. She rested a hand on his back, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall beneath her palm, a steady anchor in the swirling chaos around them. Agent Harris approached a folder tucked under his arm, his face etched with fatigue. "We've rounded up everyone we could find down there. 15 traffickers in total. Sarah and 23 kids. 23. Sarah exhaled her eyes, flicking toward the horizon. "But it's not all of them, is it?" Harris hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. "No, the man Max tackled. He wasn't the one calling the shots. There's someone else, someone higher up, and they're still out there." Max's ears twitched at Harris's voice, his head lifting slightly. His amber eyes locked onto Sarah, as if he could sense the weight of the conversation. "Then we're not done," Sarah said firmly, her spine straightening as she stood. "Not yet." The FBI's temporary command center buzzed with frenetic energy. Rows of monitors displayed live feeds from security cameras, aerial drone views, and hastily assembled maps of trafficking routes crisscrossing the country. Sarah stood beside Harris, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. As they reviewed the evidence, "We intercepted a message from one of the traffickers." "Phone B," Harris explained, pointing at a monitor they were preparing for a final shipment, one last transfer before they scatter completely. "And, Sarah," he hesitated before continuing, "the drop point is here in Dallas tonight." Sarah's brow furrowed. "They're still here," Harris nodded. "We think they're desperate with their network collapsing. They're trying to get the remaining kids out before we close in." Max, lying at Sarah's feet, let out a low growl. The sound was faint but sharp, a subtle acknowledgement of the tension in the air. "What's the plan?" Sarah asked. Harris adjusted his tie, his exhaustion briefly visible before he masked it with professionalism. "We've tracked the shipment to a cargo yard on the outskirts of the city. If we move now, we can intercept them before they disappear." Sarah knelt beside Max, her hand resting on his sturdy shoulders. "You ready, partner?" Max's tail gave a faint wag, his eyes locked on hers. With unwavering focus, he was ready. The cargo yard was a desolate place, rows of rusting shipping containers stacked haphazardly under flickering floodlights. The wind carried the scent of metal and oil, and every creak of the steel structures felt like an unwelcome intruder. In the silence, Sarah moved carefully between the containers, Max at her side. Harris and the tactical team followed at a distance. There the movements sharp and deliberate. Every shadow felt like a threat, every corner a potential ambush. Max's nose twitched, and he suddenly froze his head, turned sharply to the left, ears pricked forward. Sarah followed his gaze to a container with its doors slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within. She signaled Harris, who motioned for his team to spread out and surround the container. Max let out a low growl, his muscles coiling with anticipation. Sarah whispered, "Easy." Max were going in with a deep breath. Sarah moved forward, sidearm raised. Max patted silently beside her, his growl simmering into a low, dangerous rumble. She reached the container doors and with one swift movement pushed them open. Inside, the harsh glow of a single hanging bulb illuminated the scene. 4 children sat huddled in the corner, their faces pale with fear. Standing over them was a man in an expensive suit, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp with cold calculation. Well, he said softly, turning to face Sarah. "Your persistent Officer Collins' hands, where I can see them." Sarah barked, her weapon trained on his chest. The man smiled faintly, lifting his hands, but there was no fear in his eyes. Do you really think this ends with me? Do you think stopping me ends this? Max let out a sharp bark, his body low to the ground, ready to spring at a moment's notice. You're done, Sarah said through gritted teeth. It ends tonight. The man's smile faltered just slightly. Then I guess this is where we part ways. Before Sarah could react, he lunged to the side, pulling a hidden switch on the container wall. Alarms blared, and the container lights cut out. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the cargo yard as tactical teams engaged traffickers emerging from the shadow. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned back to the man, only to see an open escape hatch in the floor. "Max, go!" she shouted. Max lunged forward, teeth bared, disappearing into the hatch. After the fleeing suspect, Sarah followed her boots, hitting the steel ladder as she descended into darkness. The tunnel below was narrow and damp, barely wide enough to move quickly. Max was ahead, his growl echoing faintly in the confined space. The suspect's footsteps pounded somewhere ahead, but Max was gaining ground. Sarah emerged from the tunnel into a dimly lit underground chamber. Max had the man pinned to the ground, his teeth inches from the suspect's throat, a deep growl vibrating through his chest. "Call him off." The man gasped, his face contorted in fear. Sarah stood over him, her weapon still trained on him. It's over. The sound of approaching tactical boots filled the tunnel behind her. Har appeared moments later, his face lit with relief. "Sarah, you did it," he said, breathing hard. "It's over." Max released the suspect and stepped back, his tail stiff. His eyes locked on the man as tactical agents moved in to cuff him. The morning sun was rising. By the time Sarah and Max emerged from the cargo yard, the sky was painted in shades of gold and pink, a stark contrast to the heavy exhaustion. Weighing on her shoulders, children were being carried out of containers, wrapped in blankets, and held tightly by medics. Families would be reunited today because of Max, because of his instincts, and because he never wavered when it mattered most. Sarah knelt beside her partner, wrapping her arms gently around his neck. Max leaned into her, his tail wagging faintly. "You did good, Max," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "You saved them." Max's amber eyes met hers, and for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through settled between them. Nearby, Agent Harris approached, his hands in his pockets. "The network's dismantled. The children are safe, and the guy at the top, he's never seeing daylight again." Sarah nodded, her hand still resting on Max's back. "Good," as the sun rose higher in the sky, its warmth cutting through the lingering chill. Sarah stood with Max at her side. The day was breaking, and with it came the quiet knowledge that for now, the darkness had been pushed back. But as long as shadows existed, Sarah and Max would be there side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The sun hung low on the horizon as Sarah stood at the edge of the Dallas freight yard. Max sitting dutifully by her side, the chaos of the past 48 hours had settled into a somber stillness. The traffickers were in custody, the children were safe, and the sprawling network they had covered was being methodically dismantled by federal authorities. Yet despite the victory, Sarah felt an ache deep in her chest, a quiet exhaustion that reached her bones, ready to head home. Collins, Agent Harris's voice broke through her thoughts. He approached, with 2 coffees in hand, dark circles under his eyes, and a tired but satisfied smile on his face. Sarah accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, as ready as we can be. "Max deserves a break, and honestly, so do I." Harris crouched, slightly extending a hand toward Max, who gave his hand a sniff before giving it a respectful lick. "You know, I've worked with a lot of K9 teams over the years, but Max, he's something else." Sarah glanced down at her partner, the corner of her mouth lifting in a faint smile. "He's not just a partner. Harris, he's family." Max's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and he looked up at her, his amber eyes reflecting loyalty, trust, and something that went beyond words. "Go home, Sarah, you've earned it," Harris said softly. "We'll take it from here." The drive back to Denver was quiet. The hum of the car engine filled the silence as the highway stretched endlessly ahead. Max lay stretched across the back seat, his head resting on his paws, his chest. Rose and fell steadily, but every so often his eyes would flicker open, checking on Sarah in the view mirror, before slipping back into rest. Sarah's fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel as she thought about the children, the ones they'd saved, the ones who would be reunited with their families, and the ones whose faces would never leave her mind. But they had done it, Max had done it, and in a world filled with shadows, they had been a light, however brief, however flickering. The radio crackled faintly with soft country music, and for the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to breathe back in. Denver, the sun was dipping below the skyline as Sarah pulled into her apartment complex parking lot. She turned off the engine and glanced back at Max. His ears perked up, and his tail thumped gently against the seat. "Come on, buddy, let's go home." Max hopped out of the car with a grace that bellied the exhaustion Sarah knew he felt together. They climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment the moment she unlocked the door. Max padded in his nose, twitching, as he did his customary sweep of the small space. Sarah dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her boots. Max had already made himself comfortable on his bed in the corner, his head resting on his oversized stuffed bear, the only toy he'd never managed to tear apart. Sarah poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the kitchen counter. The apartment felt too quiet after days of chaos, the silence pressing in on her ears. But it was a good silence, a peaceful one. She looked at Max, who was watching her, with his ever-present focus, his tail giving one soft wag, Sarah said softly, walking over and kneeling beside him. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." "Max, I hope you know that." MX lifted his head slightly, pressing his nose against her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more weight than any words ever could. The commendation ceremony was held a week later at the Denver Police Department headquarters. The room was packed with officers, federal agents, families, and a handful of reporters with cameras flashing in the background. Sarah stood in her formal uniform, the rows of medals on her chest gleaming under the bright lights, but next to her, stealing the show as always, was Max. His coat had been brushed until it shone, and he wore his own miniat, a medal on his harness. The chief of police stepped forward, his voice clear and steady as he spoke into the microphone. "Today we honor Officer Sarah Collins and her K-9 partner Max for their extraordinary bravery and dedication. Their actions not only dismantled a dangerous trafficking network but saved countless innocent lives. Heroes come in many forms, and today we celebrate one officer and one incredible dog who reminded us all of what true courage looks like." Applause filled the room. Sarah's throat tightened and she glanced down at Max, who sat proudly by her side, his ears up his tail, wagging slightly. He seemed to understand the weight of the moment after the ceremony. Sarah knelt beside him, threading her fingers through his fur. "They're clapping for you, buddy. You earned it." Max gave her hand a gentle lick, his tail thumping steadily against the polished floor. That evening, Sarah and Max turned to their favorite spot, a quiet overlook just outside the city. The sun was setting, bathing the sky in hues of orange and gold. Sarah sat on the hood of her SUV, Max sitting beside her, with his nose lifted slightly into the breeze. The city stretched out below them, distant and glittering. Somewhere out there, families were being reunited. Somewhere out there, children were safe and warm because Max had barked at a vending machine and refused to walk away. "You know, Max," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying in the wind, "sometimes it feels like the world is so dark, like there's just too much of it."
Max turned his head, looking at her with those sharp, understanding amber eyes. But then there's you. She continued, her lips curving into a faint smile. You remind me that even in the darkest places there's still light. Max let out a soft huff, leaning against her leg as the sun dipped below the horizon. For a moment, everything was still the weight of the past few weeks. The exhaustion, the fear, all of it faded into the quiet hum of the wind and the steady presence of her partner beside her. The world wasn't perfect, but for now it was enough. And Sarah knew as long as Max was by her side, they could face whatever came next.